Good afternoon. That's better. Welcome to Lunch with Books. Turn off your cell phones, please. The Upper Ohio Valley Historical Review. We have copies now. They're $5 a piece. I have some with you today. If you want one, see me after the program. Next week on the 14th, so Midway was the 4th of June, and of course yesterday, the 6th, was D-Day, but we'll be talking about D-Day next week with Jared Frederick, who's from Penn State Altoona, and has a book about D-Day. And then that same week on Friday, special Friday program at 12:30, not 12, 12:30, don't come early, because there's a children's program. We'll have a special program launching the Juneteenth celebration that Wheeling will be having. It's called Crossing the River for Freedom, Slavery, and the Underground Railroad. And Christina Essel is the new director and curator of that museum in Flushing, Ohio. And she's done a lot of research on the Underground Railroad in Belmont and slavery in Wheeling. So that's the thrust of what that will be about. And on Tuesday, the 21st, Eli Lambie will be back. He did the West Virginia songs for us last December. This time he'll be doing Wheeling songs, such as the Wheeling Bridge Polka, the Wheeling Musical Steelworkers theme song, and many others. Moon Over Ogilvie is another one. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is the 4th of June was the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Midway. John Brobst is here. He's an associate professor of history at Ohio University, where he teaches courses on the British Empire, geopolitics, and naval history. He is the author of The Future of the Great Game, Sir Olaf Caroe, India's Independence, and the Defense of Asia, and is currently completing a book about maritime strategy in the Indian Ocean during the Cold War. He received his Ph.D. in history from University of Texas at Austin, and his BA in history from University of Kansas. Oh, I also want to mention before I bring him on, if you're interested in adult summer reading, it started yesterday. Just register, read whatever you want, turn in your reading logs, and you'll be eligible to win great prizes. The drawings are held weekly. Sorry about that. Like I was saying, here is Professor John Brobst.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I realize this is probably my first trip out of Athens, aside from like 2 to Columbus in 2 years. So it's a nice drive up yesterday evening. So hopefully this will go well. I have not written a book about Midway. I've sort of been writing around it for years. I wrote a book on long-range British defense planning during World War II. For the aftermath of World War II, and as the British prepared to come out of India, which dealt largely with the Indian Ocean. And I'm now finishing a book about really the Anglo-American alliance, from a British perspective, in the Indian Ocean after World War II. So sort of beats around the bush with Midway. But I've certainly been talking about Midway for the better part of 20 years in different classes in naval history. So I was grateful for the opportunity to actually speak to a group other than 19-year-olds who don't seem to care much about as Sean said, the 4th of June was the anniversary of the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Midway. Actually, the 4th was the anniversary of the main action in the Battle of Midway. The naval battles take place over huge distances. I tried to figure out, just give you a sense of the distances involved. The Midway Atoll is the last part of the Hawaiian archipelago. It's actually not part of the state of Hawaii, but it is part of the Hawaiian Islands. It is, by distance, Midway itself, 1,300 miles from Oahu, from Honolulu. That's the same distance as Wheeling to Denver on I-70. The distances here involved are enormous. At any rate, the battle itself unfolded between the 3rd of June and the 7th of June. It has, as far as I know, it has the distinction of being the only naval battle fought across the international date line. Not only did neither side's ships actually spot one another, it was the aircraft that spotted one another, aside from a submarine seeing ships through periscopes. So the dates and things actually get confusing if you're trying to follow Japanese dates and Japanese times. For the Japanese, everything's a day ahead. Their forces were actually on the other side of the international date line. And then the navies, and this gets very confusing for historians interested in nitpicking things. The Japanese carrier force operated on Tokyo time, which was 7 hours different. And the American force actually operated on Honolulu time, which was in the 1940s, 2 hours different from Midway. Today, it's because of some weird kink in the time zone. I think it's an hour different. At any rate, the times I'm giving are, as far as I know, actually all local times, for local Midway times, for whatever that's worth. At any rate, I had been trying to think of some sort of hook to start off, rather than just going right into the 4th. I checked to see what had actually transpired on the 7th. The Japanese forces essentially quit the battle on the pre-dawn hours of June 5th. And withdrew, and then there were some stragglers around through the 6th of June. And as far as anyone knows, the Japanese were clean out of the area by the 7th. But the American carriers, the surviving ones, stuck around until June 9th to reassure themselves that everything was in hand and the victory had. Really the last, though, major event or action in the battle itself actually occurred on June 7th. That today is actually the 80th anniversary of the last major casualty of the battle. In fact, it happened at precisely this hour of Midway time, just after 5 a.m. Midway time. So by today's lights, around noon our time, the USS Yorktown, America's the fifth aircraft carrier the United States had ever built, rolled over in the Central Pacific. It capsized. The picture here is actually not the capsizing, obviously. When it capsized, it revealed a giant hole in the starboard bilge, just under what would have been the island, really a gaping hole that was irreparable. About 2 hours later, so about 2 o'clock our time, Yorktown sunk. It was the last major casualty of the battle. It was one of 3 American aircraft carriers to fight in the battle, and the one that the United States lost. The picture you see here is actually from June 4th, the afternoon of June 4th, when Yorktown twice came under attack by Japanese bombers and torpedo bombers. It survived the initial fight with limited damage, got back into the action, only to be attacked again later in the afternoon. At which point Yorktown was pretty severely crippled. In fact, the skipper had to gave an order to abandon ship. But after several hours, the damaged crews that had remained on board seemed to have the fires that had broken out in hand and had high hopes the ship could be salvaged. Volunteer crews went back on board to try to right the ship. Over the course of the evening or the day of June the 5th, but on the morning of June the 6th, a straggling Japanese submarine spotted Yorktown and put a torpedo into it beneath the waterline, and that sealed Yorktown's fate. But at any rate, Yorktown sunk at precisely this hour 80 years ago. So today is in some ways the anniversary or an anniversary of the Battle of Midway. Again, though, the main action took place on the 4th of June, which is why that day goes down. I will say, I noticed, last night, yesterday, of course, marked the 78th anniversary of D-Day, and this will get to a point I want to emphasize really later on by way of commemorating Midway. I noticed in this that, and this is a complaint the Navy always has, D-Day always overshadows Midway. Everyone forgets that Midway, which was the first of the great turning points of World War II, occurred roughly the same time frame. as the Battle of Midway. And that sort of was driven that home thing last night, watching the story about a memorial for D-Day. With not a mention of Midway, you never hear about Midway. And this and 78 years, it's important, but it seems an odd anniversary as opposed to 80, these 10-year gaps. So it seems fitting to actually try to commemorate Midway at some point. Now, I'd like to do that by really trying to emphasize the broader, what I call global significance of Midway, by which I don't mean different perspectives from different parts of the world, but rather the way in which the outcome of the battle affected the whole course of World War II. Help to tie everything together, what we might call the grand strategic view of the battle, and also to say maybe something about longer term historical significance of it, to say something about Midway, maybe in comparison to later events, not least another anniversary in June. This next Tuesday marks the 40th anniversary of Great Britain's victory in the Falkland Islands War of 1982. I hope, if I get to it at the end here, to suggest that there is actually some comparison between what happened at Midway and the Falklands, at least by sort of broader lesson or broader significance. And I'm going to try and do this in 3 parts. I want to say something along the lines of the conventional story of the battle itself, just to refamiliarize you, or familiarize you if you're not all that familiar with the details of the battle. Then say something about this global impact of the war, the wider strategic historical significance of the battle, and then hopefully try to conclude by saying again something about how Midway compares or fits into a longer term perspective, especially in relation to what happened with the British and the Argentines in the Falklands 40 years ago. So let me start by, I have a whole sequence of maps in here. I think my fascination with maps drives some of my students crazy. But I was, as an undergraduate, I was a double major in history and geography. And even though I became a historian by training, the geography has always stuck with me. And I also tried in any kind of lecture to use maps from the period at hand. And also, I tend to like maps that force you to, or ask you to look at the world in maybe a somewhat different way than you're used to. Some of my favorite maps are maps like these, so-called orthographic maps that try to recreate on a flat surface the image of a globe. You can get a sense of how big, say, the Pacific is, which covers the Pacific Ocean as a third of the world's surface. So it's a big space, and it's on a map like this, that depicts Japan's early advances between Pearl Harbor, which was December 7th, 1941, and Midway in June of 1942. This map, I have 2 more I'm going to show you, are from an atlas that was produced toward the end of World War II, early in the late 1944, early 1945, by the US Navy. The maps were drawn by a cartographer who probably should be better known than he actually is, a man named Richard Eads Harrison, whose I guess main claim to fame at the time was he drew all the weekly maps for Fortune magazine. He was famous for this particular, his own fascination with these orthographic maps. This US Navy atlas was in these sort of steel blue shades, but many of Eads Harrison's maps, I just don't have any in this slide pack, were done in very vibrant colors, and they're quite striking and really do show, he'll show the world at very different perspectives. So taking the globe and rotating it one way or another, so that you can look, say, at the German invasion of Russia by looking from the north to the south over the earth. I always tell my students that the Eads Harrison maps are, from a mathematical standpoint, dead accurate. And sometimes the terrain might be a bit exaggerated for effect, but the things are in the right position relative to one another. And what I tell my students is, it just goes to show you what a map like this, what you can do with watercolors and trigonometry. You don't need Google Earth.
We have Sean turn the lights down, will that affect you, that we can see them?
It won't affect me at all. I don't know how to turn the lights down. That a little bit better?
Yeah, right there.
You see this blue ball, and you can see this, these arrows descending across this huge expanse of just the Western Pacific. On the title up there, I don't know if you can make it out, is amphibious blitzkrieg. What this map is showing is Japan's sort of lightning advance through the Western Pacific and into Southeast Asia that occurred in the 6 months between Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Midway in December of 1941 and the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. Japan launched simultaneous with Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese also attacked American positions throughout the Western Pacific. Within weeks, both Guam and Wake Island had fallen to Japanese control. Wake Island fell just before Christmas. Guam fell actually even faster. Guam fell in about 9 to 10 days, I think. I'm not sure exactly on the date, but Guam fell much faster. The Japanese also attacked the Philippines at the same time, which remained an American protectorate. The Philippines held out until May of 1942. At least the great American fortress on the island of Corregidor in Manila Bay held out until May. But frankly, the Japanese had pretty effective control of the Philippines within a few months at the most. So really a lightning blitz. And also what you can see on this map is the Japanese descend through chunks of territory that were controlled, first and foremost by the British. So that out on that easternmost edge of those arrows is Japan's descent down through the Gilbert Islands and the Ellis Islands in the direction of New Zealand. Farther west, the Japanese descend into the Solomon Islands, north of Australia, which were effectively part of the British Empire. They're actually managed by the Australians and had been German territory before World War I, and after World War I become British/Australian territory. The Japanese, when they attacked American positions, also seized Hong Kong, which was still a British colony. In 1941. The Japanese had, of course, begun their invasion of China in 1931 by seizing the northern province of Manchuria, and then in 1937 had invaded China proper. So for several years before 1941, the Japanese had been essentially hovering outside Hong Kong, and it was a fairly quick grab for them. The Japanese also, at the same time, this was December, January of 1941, while the Japanese Navy is advancing rapidly through the Pacific, through islands in the Pacific, the Japanese Army storms Malaya, which was then a British colony, and advanced down the peninsula to reach Singapore, which surrendered to the Japanese on February 15th of 1942. By early March, the Dutch East Indies, what is today Indonesia, had surrendered to Japan. Understand that although the Netherlands had fallen to the Nazis in the previous spring, in May of 1940, the colonial government in the Netherlands East Indies had remained allied to the British, and then subsequently with the United States after American entry into World War I in 1941. So the Netherlands East Indies had, even though the home government was under Nazi occupation, the Netherlands East Indies had remained had remained in the war on the Allied side. But the Netherlands East Indies falls to Japanese occupation in early March of 1941. The Netherlands East Indies was really the ultimate objective, or at least the medium-term objective, of what the Japanese had done in December of 1941. The big prize were the oil fields of the Netherlands East Indies. And from a Japanese perspective, particularly the perspective of the Japanese Navy, the oil fields of the Netherlands East Indies stood to make Japan self-sufficient in its oil supply. Now, beyond that, the Japanese had a much further design, but the really sort of immediate main objective of this blitzkrieg was were the oil fields. The attack on Pearl Harbor was in some ways a giant rearguard action. The sense on the part of the Japanese was that the one potential spoiler of their ambitions in the Western Pacific was the United States Navy. Their sense was that as much as the British and the Dutch might want to fight on, they were too distracted by the events in Europe. And so Britain wouldn't be able to put up much of a fight. It was only the United States, and the idea was knock the United States off their feet for a while and then present the Americans with a fait accompli. In hindsight, of course, Pearl Harbor did not do that, not least because the Japanese did not catch American aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor in that attack in December of 1941, which is what allows the Americans to put up a fight early on, to strike some counter punches, and to actually win what proved a decisive victory at Midway just 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The turning point of the Pacific, in other words, comes comparatively very rapidly after this also equally impressive Japanese advance here in the spring through the winter and spring of 1941. Now, it is, I do want to point out again that the United States does, in this period, these first 6 months, land some counter punches of its own. In February, so 2 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy mounts 2 sets of raids by aircraft carrier groups through the Pacific Islands. Admiral Bill Halsey led a task group centered on the carrier Enterprise on a raid through the Marshall Islands, which Japan had already had held since the end of World War I. The Japanese had occupied the Marshalls had been German territory, and the Japanese the Japanese occupied them as the Japanese were on the Allied side of World War I and had occupied German territory throughout the Pacific. At any rate, the United States launches a raid through the Marshall Islands, which, if you look on this map, would essentially be under where the word ocean appears, under Pacific Ocean. There was another set of carrier raids led by Admiral Frank Fletcher with the carrier Yorktown at the center of it, and also the carrier Lexington, that went through the Gilbert Islands, which are farther to the southwest on that map. And beyond that, beyond those 2 raids, the most famous, there was a third carrier raid, which is far and away the most famous. This was the so-called Doolittle Raid, which occurred on April the 18th of 1941. In the case of the Doolittle Raid, which involved the aircraft carrier Hornet, which would also be one of the 3 American carriers at Midway, along with Enterprise and Yorktown. The Hornet embarked several, I want to say it was 16, 17, U.S. Army Air Force B-25s, medium-sized land-based bombers, and steamed to a point, well, they launched the aircraft about 750 miles east of the Japanese coast and bombed Tokyo. The plan was to get somewhat closer, but Japanese fishing trawlers had spotted the advance of the force, and the fear was surprise had been lost. And so off the planes went. Bomb Japan they did, or bomb Tokyo they did. The physical damage of the Doolittle Raid was negligible. And in fact, the same can be said of these carrier raids through the Marshalls and the Gilberts. Various airfields were raided. Some damage was done, but nothing of any real significance. The real significance of those raids, all 3 of them put together, was the psychological impact, which was incalculable. In the case of the United States, these 3 raids, and especially the Doolittle Raid, served as substantial boosts to morale. But I think in some ways, given what happens at Midway, it was the effect on Japan that was even more fateful. It was those 3 raids that convinced the Japanese high command, especially the naval high command, that they simply could not tolerate these 3 or 4 American aircraft carriers roaming around the Pacific. The immediate sense after Pearl Harbor was, well, the bulk of the fleet has been incapacitated, or at least a substantial portion of the American fleet has been incapacitated. Its main battleships are as a force not capable of functioning yet. And so we can ignore the carriers and hope for the best and complete the conquest of the Western Pacific. But the United States sends its carriers into action right away, and they are scoring hits. It's visible. You can't ignore it. And so the Japanese Navy comes to the conclusion, or its high command comes to the conclusion, that those carriers are going to have to be hunted down and destroyed before Japan can embark on any further program of conquest in Asia. Priority one is to find those carriers and destroy them. The senior naval officer in Japan, the commander at the time of the commanding officer of the Navy as a whole, Isoroku Yamamoto, comes up with a plan, or thinks he sees in Midway Atoll the perfect lure to bait the Americans out, to bait these carriers out into a battle on a time and at a place of his choosing, in other words, on Japan's terms. But and the logic was that Midway, again, 1,300 miles out from Oahu, was this ideal location. It was at once close enough to Hawaii that there was no way, Yamamoto figured, and he was right about this, that the Americans could ignore a Japanese attack on Midway, let alone the Japanese seizure of an island that close. On the other hand, it was far enough out from Hawaii that land-based air power, long-range bombers based on Hawaii, did not have the range to actually land any counterpunches. It would have to be done by aircraft carriers or by naval forces. So that was Yamamoto's logic. Clever, not by any measure insane. But as it turned out, Yamamoto, or the Japanese in this case, that the cat was actually the mouse, unbeknownst to them. What the Japanese did not know, had no awareness of, was that the US Navy cryptographers had already broken, not all, but a critical portion of Japan's naval code. The United States had actually in the 1930s broken Japan's diplomatic code. It was a code that the Japanese foreign ministry is able to communicate with its embassies around the world in. And early in the course of the war, a substantial percentage of the naval code had been broken. The result was that the US Navy was reading a critical portion of Japanese communications ahead of Midway, and had obtained and were able to provide the American commander at Pearl Harbor, Chester Nimitz, with a kind of foreknowledge, or at least a knowledge of Yamamoto's basic plan. In other words, Nimitz knew it was coming and knew roughly what Yamamoto's timetable was, which is in and of itself a key thing. But as Nimitz was the first to point out, as remarkable as the intelligence achievement was, and as important as it was in hindsight, and it genuinely was, it didn't resolve everything. The picture of intelligence provided was by no means complete. It wasn't exact. Nimitz was emphasized both in hindsight and at the time, ahead of the battle, that ultimately a whole lot would pivot simply on fortune, on sheer luck. In fact, what strikes me at least as a real sign that Nimitz thought this way or felt this way was that the point he picked a point to the northeast of Midway, about 200 miles northeast of Midway, where he had sent the three American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, to rendezvous and await the approach of the Japanese. He called that point on the map, which was just out in the open ocean, he called it Point Luck. The idea luck was just going to come down to being in the right place at the right time, and some guesses were going to have to be made. They knew the Japanese were coming. They knew roughly when Yamamoto's forces would arrive, but beyond that, it was wide open. What point of the compass the Japanese would make their final approach from was unknown. This is a world that's again, so this kind of thing I have to emphasize to my students at the time, or the 1940s. This was a world without satellites. This was a world without, you had radar, but you didn't have long-range radars, and most ships didn't have radars on them. There was a radar on Midway, but it was limited. It wasn't particularly precise, so a lot hung in the air, and there was still the ability to, even if the Japanese did not have strategic surprise, they might have been able to obtain surprise in the moment. So a lot really does come down to just sheer coincidence, sheer good luck, and good guessing on the part of the Americans. So here's, let me say something about the battle here. The Americans do, in fact, get lucky, probably several times over the course of this battle. The approach of Japanese forces, or the first American reconnaissance of aircraft to spot Japanese forces, did so on June the 3rd, on the late afternoon, early evening of June the 3rd. And in fact, the first shots of battle were fired at that point when an American patrol aircraft dropped a torpedo in the water, which actually missed its target. As it turned out, the ships that the Americans had spotted on June 3rd were not actually Japan's main carrier force. The Americans had actually spotted the amphibious group that was coming to land on Midway. And then the night goes on and nothing much happens until early morning, around dawn of June the 4th, the Japanese aircraft carriers, 4 of them, materialize, or at least their air groups materialize, attacking, launching an air raid on Midway Island itself, which had an airfield on it. And that airfield gets off several aircraft, fighter aircraft, and then a sort of varied group of different land-based bombers. There were a couple of Navy land-based bombers at the time, and then both a set of U.S. Army B-26s and U.S. Army B-17s. And those land-based bombers launch around 7 a.m. They find the Japanese aircraft carriers, and over the next hour, make their own attack runs at those aircraft carriers. No bombs hit. This is just a complete failure, and several of these bombers are shot down. And even what is a more notorious, or I think even greater tragedy ensues when about 9 in the morning, the first American carrier aircraft began their attacks on the Japanese aircraft carriers. This was 2 squadrons of American torpedo bombers, which the particular type of aircraft was the Douglas Devastator, which was an airplane that had been designed in the mid-1930s, and by 1941 was already considered obsolescent by the U.S. Navy. In fact, they had already begun production of the main torpedo bomber that the U.S. Navy would use through World War II, the Avenger, which is the bomber George H.W. Bush flew later in the war. At any rate, aircraft carrier groups were not yet equipped with the Avenger. They had these older Devastators. You go, to paraphrase what Don Rumsfeld, I guess you go to war with the Navy you have, not one you want to have. At any rate, the Devastators, to drop their torpedoes, had to make their runs at a ship at a very low level. So we're talking 50 feet, 100 feet off the water to drop the torpedo in without it diving too deep and becoming useless or breaking apart on the water's surface. At any rate, these a group of, I think the number is 41 total, it's just over 40 Devastators in 2 squadrons, one off Enterprise, one off Hornet, began their runs around 9 o'clock in the morning at these Japanese carriers. Of those 41 aircraft, 37 were shot down. In the case of the torpedo squadron off of Hornet, every single aircraft was shot down. And there was only one survivor, a pilot named George Gay. The Enterprise squadron did not lose all their aircraft. They lost most of them. In each case, no torpedoes struck any aircraft carrier. So a complete failure. And then a final wave of torpedo bombers, about 10 in the morning, launched off of Yorktown, makes their run at one of the Japanese aircraft carriers. In fact, it was the aircraft carrier Hiryu that was farther north of this group. That attack goes just as the first two went, and no hits were scored, but it had the effect of drawing Japan's fighter aircraft that were covering those aircraft carriers down to a very low altitude to engage those ships at a critical moment. You know, an hour earlier, the fact that Japan's Zero fighters were down at 100, 200 feet really didn't matter if airplanes were coming in at higher altitude. The Zero could climb very fast, but it still needed several minutes to do that. At 10:15, 10:20 in the morning on June the 4th, you didn't have the 15, 20 minutes the fighters would need to get back up to altitude. And at that very moment, and this is the sort of scene that's depicted here in this painting, American Dauntless dive bombers arrived. This was a different type of bomber. It was a new state-of-the-art bomber at the time. Its job would be to carry a bomb either at 500 pounds or 1,000 pounds. Some Dauntlesses were configured to fly a scouting role, so they'd carry a lighter payload, so they'd have greater range to scout. Others would carry a larger bomb. So you have these Dauntless dive bombers, some with 500-pound bombs, some with 1,000-pound bombs. There are going to be ultimately 3 squadrons of these. The first 2 to arrive were off of Yorktown and Enterprise. Actually, the Hornet squadron was out there, but the Hornet's Dauntless squadron had actually failed to spot the aircraft carriers and were beyond the point of no return and had to turn back to their carrier before making any attacks. But these other 2 squadrons arrive over the Japanese carriers sometime between 10:20 and 10:25 in the morning. Now, what follows is an episode, depending on which historian you ask, the timetable is either 10 minutes or 5 minutes or 4 minutes. In the US Navy, they're still talking about the so-called famous 4 minutes of Midway, where, you know, I said that the main action of the battle occurred on June the 4th. There's going to be some significant fighting later in the afternoon. Yorktown actually isn't lost until June the 7th. But really, let's just stick with the 4 minutes. At 10:26 in the morning of June the 4th, the battle seemed to be going Japan's way. Japan seemed to have the day. By 10:30, the tide had completely turned. Japan had effectively lost the battle. According to Japan's own air group commander, those 4 minutes cost Japan the war. Those dive bombers began their dive. They were up at about 15,000 feet. They spot the aircraft carriers, pitch over, and come screaming down. A few hundred miles an hour, several hundred miles an hour, at something like a 70-degree angle, right on top of these carriers. The bulk of them, and this goes to luck too, some of the luck was actually spotting these carriers. The way it was done was the lead pilot in the Enterprise squadron had actually spotted a lone Japanese destroyer that was moving at high speed to the northwest. And the aircraft commander, who's the squadron commander, figured that it must be heading back to the main group that somehow had gotten lost, and so decided just to follow the destroyer. That turned out to be the right call. They'd say, you guys arrived right over these carriers at the right time. They began their dive, but here's where the second part of luck in this actual fight goes. The bulk of and it's roughly a group here of almost, I guess, about 40 Dauntlesses. The bulk of them, let's just say it's 40, 37 of those 40 dive at one aircraft carrier, dive at the Japanese carrier Kaga, which is this one you see right here in the front, just one plane after another, to the point where one Japanese observer called it the silver waterfall. These planes coming down over the course of about 3 minutes. And several bombs hit across the flight deck. 3 Dauntlesses, just 3, go after the farther ship you see up there on the above Kaga. That's the Akagi, which was actually the flagship of the group. 3 American Dauntlesses dive on Akagi. Part of it was of the 2 squadrons. One squadron, the bulk of it, just for whatever reason, did not follow their commander onto the target he selected. And that was a pilot named Richard Best, who dives on Akagi. He drops his 1,000-pound bomb, which hits. Dead center on the flight deck, goes right through it, explodes in the hangar, starting what became a completely uncontrollable fire. Akagi remained afloat for the better part it remained afloat through the afternoon, and right after midnight, the skipper had decided the damage was so bad that the ship had to be scuttled. Kaga had already sunk by that point earlier in the afternoon. But the thing about Akagi was only one bomb hit. Best's 2 wingmen dropped their bombs, but they failed to actually hit Akagi. So Akagi was actually lit ablaze, unstoppable fire with 1 bomb. Kaga was essentially hammered and all but obliterated. The Soryu, which I'm not sure whether that one that's exploding there is Soryu or simply another warship. The carriers there were sort of 3 in a group, and this other one, they're moving in this picture here. They should be moving to the north, and the 4th carrier would have been in this painting farther up to the north. By the way, the painting I have here, which I just like for whatever reason, hangs in the Naval Historical Center in Washington. It was actually done in 1975, but I think it sort of captures this famous episode here reasonably nicely, at least. At any rate, the Soryu was also hit about the same time in a second wave, and also crippled. All 3 of those carriers had sunk by dawn of the next morning. There was a 4th carrier, the Hiryu, that would be off to the north in this picture, that was what had escaped for the time being. It was not struck in these famous 4 minutes. It was hit later in the day by aircraft in Yorktown's air wing. What had happened there was, after this had happened, Hiryu, which was off by itself, launches has rearmed its bombers, launches them to find the American carriers. The carrier that Hiryu's air group finds was the Yorktown. They launched the first attack on Yorktown. That attack actually shut down the ability to recover aircraft on Yorktown. Yorktown's planes were still in the air at this time, and so Yorktown's planes were forced to land on Enterprise, where they rearmed, went back up in the air, and they found Hiryu, and were able to attack the aircraft carrier, the Japanese aircraft carrier Hiryu later in the afternoon. Their bombs hit, and I should have had a picture of it in there. It's a fairly impressive picture, a photograph of what happened to Hiryu. Their bombs all hit forward and just ripped the flight deck of the carrier from the middle part all the way forward. Hiryu sunk just hours after that.
Were there any survivors from Midway in town ships? Are any of these ships were there survivors?
So in the case of Yorktown, in the case of the American one, most of the crew survived. So the crew of Yorktown, it would have had a complement of somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500, and the number killed on Yorktown was in the range of 300 to 400, which is tremendous, but it's the bulk of the crew. And while the air group suffered the loss of its torpedo squadron, the fighters and Dauntless dive bombers from Yorktown by and large survived because they were in the air at the time Yorktown was attacked as opposed to on board ship, and they simply landed on the Enterprise, another aircraft carrier. Now, in the case of the Japanese, the result was very different. Just sort of where I'm heading with this business about this battle being quite decisive. Japan loses these 4 carriers. They're not the only carriers Japan has. There are 4 of Japan's largest carriers. There are 4 of the 6 aircraft carriers that were involved in the raid on Pearl Harbor. The other 2 big aircraft carriers that had been involved on the raid on Pearl Harbor were not at Midway, and they were not at Midway simply by a fluke. This was an aircraft carrier, the Zaikaku and the Shokaku. They had both been involved in the Battle of the Coral Sea that had taken place off Australia in early May of 1942. And those 2 aircraft carriers had each been significantly damaged in one way or another in the battle, and were back in Japan being refitted and repaired. One of them had essentially not suffered, the ship hadn't suffered a lot of damage, but a very large portion of its air wing had been destroyed in the Battle of Coral Sea and had gone back to Japan to take on board new aircraft and new pilots. The other carrier, I always get mixed up which one is which. The other of these 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor had been very substantially damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea and was itself undergoing repairs. Both of those carriers, those 2 that had been involved in Pearl Harbor and were not at Midway, were eventually sunk in 1944 in separate battles by the U.S. Navy. But here at Midway, the Japanese lose 4 of the 6 carriers involved in Midway, and those 4 represented about, I think offhand, that in 1942, Japan had 13 or 14 aircraft carriers total. So this was it's by no means the whole carrier force, but we're still talking a quarter to a third of the carrier force, and the 4 they lost were 4 of Japan's most modern, largest aircraft carriers. But beyond that, it was the human casualties they took. Japan had almost no survivors off of those aircraft carriers, aside from ones that would have been picked up in the water by American forces. And they lost, just in the battle alone, lost a substantial, not just number, but proportion of pilots in the Japanese Navy. The Battle of Midway literally decimated Japan's naval air force of its pilots. And by literally decimated, I mean that historians estimate that Japan lost 10% of its pilots, or its Navy's pilots, in the Battle of Midway. But even more than that, and it's, the pilots get all the attention. Even more, I think certainly naval historians tend to think that the most significant impact was the loss of the mechanics and technicians that maintained those planes. That number wasn't 10%. Most historians think that Japan lost somewhere between a third and maybe 40% of the aviation mechanics and technicians in its Navy in the Battle of Midway. Those couldn't be replaced, at least not quickly. So the battle has a devastating impact in that sense. Another statistic that you rarely see, and I think I only know because I taught for several years at Ohio. I've taught a class on the history of oil, and it said so. Somehow I had come across this in a reading about the Japanese merchant marine during World War II. But before the Japanese launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, they knew they'd be in a fight for their lives, and they'd have to win big victories up front quickly before their resource base ran down. And so they had stockpiled a year's worth of oil. The assumption was if everything went right, they would conquer the oil fields of the northeast end of the Netherlands East Indies, and the oil would start flowing back to Japan safe and sound. Now, in the event, in the end, that's not what happens. That was the calculation. But they knew that they would have to get through a period on whatever stockpile they had built up. They had roughly a year's worth of oil at least based on what the Japanese Navy burned in an average year. In the Battle of Midway alone, the Japanese Navy burned 5% of Japan's national reserve of oil in one battle. and let's just count in this case the battle, that includes the steaming out from Japan and the steaming back, but a lot of that is just steaming around at high speed for 4 days in the middle of the Pacific. That, it's a marginal amount, but it makes all the difference. And it helps to explain why the US submarine effort, which focused on targeting Japan's merchant trade, proved so effective in the aftermath of Midway. It takes a year or two for it to really ratchet up, but the Japanese lose a significant margin of their oil that they're never able to make up. And as submarine attacks on Japanese tankers increasingly bite, the Japanese are just having a harder and harder time finding the fuel to move their ships around. You don't think about that with Midway. And it's something that's not really apparent to American planners or American intelligence until much later. But we know in hindsight that that's one of the effects Midway had. In addition to the loss, to the sort of staggering loss of life, each of these carriers, the Japanese were losing hundreds of men. I want to say Japan's total losses in the battle were in the vicinity of 4,000 casualties, whereas the Americans lose several hundred. Personnel. Japan is that much greater, but a lot of that, again, it's pilots, skilled technicians, and then this business about just burning through a national fuel supply. In that sense, that helps explain why Midway is such a decisive turning point in the war. But to be sure, and I want to emphasize this, because historians will almost always be quick to point out that the tide turned after Midway, but it turned slowly. Again, you have the sheer distances of the Pacific, but it's also going to take it took the follow-on effect of several other campaigns the United States pursues against Japan to finally smash Japan's naval power. First and foremost was the Solomons campaign that began in the fall of 1942, so a few months after Midway. And the Solomons campaign included the famous and bloody battle for control of the island of Guadalcanal, which people have heard of. And that episode begins in the fall of 1942 and lasts, the Solomons campaign, the main part of it lasts through the spring of 1943. And when you combine that with Midway, those two actions really, Midway really busts up, at least disrupts Japan's, this Navy's operational capacity. And the Solomons campaign really sucks the attention of forces forward deployed and prevents them from going after other things. So you have the Solomons campaign, and then frankly, it really isn't until 1944. And these there's another set of carrier battles in 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and then the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Leyte Gulf is in the Philippines itself, but it takes those two battles to sort of once and for all smash Japan's naval power. But I think it's fair, and I think there's a reason historians tend to still go back and say, well, Midway, that we can fairly characterize Midway as the turning point. And certainly from hindsight, we can do that, even if it's fair to say and important to say that there was a lot more fighting to be done. There were enormous distances involved. And frankly, it just took time after Midway to build the ships to fight across the Pacific, to train the crews, to build a navy. One of the real features of the Battle of Midway was that the force that fought was the professional navy that had been built up in peacetime in the 1930s. And the Navy, just like the army that marches across Europe from the West later in the war, the Navy that makes its way to Japan is a Navy that is built up by the thousands after 1942. My grandfather was one of these so-called 90-day wonders. Was a 42-year-old lawyer at the time of Midway, and is then brought into the Navy as an air intelligence officer and winds up on Tinian in 1944 and 1945. And that was a typical experience and one we associate with the Army, the Navy, with the U.S. war effort. But the Battle of Midway, one of the hallmarks of it was that the forces that fought were essentially the force, the professional Navy that had been developed over the course of the 1930s. And it's going to take time to expand that force out into this giant force that is going to win the war. Now, as usual, I always go on too long, but I do want to say something here about the global importance, just to sum up here. The quote I have here is by James Schlesinger, who I'm sure some of you have heard of. Schlesinger was a kind of fixture in American defense circles in the 70s and 1980s as a commentator. In the 1970s, James Schlesinger, who was an economist by training, served as Secretary of Defense under both President Nixon and President Ford. He also was Secretary of Energy in the Carter administration. And then in the 1980s and 90s, he was a kind of regular commentator on national security affairs on the Sunday morning shows and so on. Schlesinger died around 2010. At any rate, in 2003, on what would have been the 61st anniversary of Midway, he gave a talk to a group of Midway veterans in Washington, in which his whole shtick was to argue that Midway was this battle that doesn't get the respect it deserves, that Midway languishes in the shadow of D-Day, and in fact, Midway was, by his lights, the real turning point of the war itself. His argument wasn't a particularly original one. Others had made it. It's an argument that in recent times, since Schlesinger's comments in 2003, has really gained traction among historians and has been subject, at least indirectly and implicitly, in any number of books. The basic argument goes like this, with that the sequence of turning points in World War II, at least in terms of battles, the big ones were Midway and the Pacific, which is the first, even though it actually is a turning point against the last powers to enter the war, Japan and the United States. It's Midway, and then the Battle of Alamein in the western desert of Egypt, where British Empire forces stopped the German advance into the Middle East. That occurs in November of 1942. And then Stalingrad on the plains of the Volga River in central Russia, where the German advance into Russia is reversed and thrown into into what we know in hindsight was a permanent retreat. And then, of course, the Normandy landings, D-Day, the Stalingrad was the surrender of German forces was February of 1943, and then D-Day, the Normandy invasion in June of 1944. The last turning point, which everybody forgets, was the Battle of Impal Kohima on the Indian frontier. This was actually Japan's last major advance. It's very late in the war, so long after Midway. Japan's actually still on the offensive on land in Southeast Asia, and actually only crosses into British Indian territory for the first time in the summer of 1944, in July of 1944. They crossed the Burmese frontier into India, where the Britain's Indian Army stops the Japanese hold and throws them back. But of those 5 turning points, Midway is the first. And at least by my lights, and certainly by Schlesinger's lights, that order is not coincidental. That without Midway, you don't get to Alamein. And without Alamein, you don't get to Stalingrad. And you don't really even get to D-Day. The logic here was that, I'm going to go to this map. So this is another one of these East Harrison maps showing sea lanes across the Indian Ocean. Across those sea lanes was the way the British built up their force at Alamein in the Western Desert. Australian troops, Indian troops, troops from Britain could not go through the Mediterranean. They had to go around Africa and up. Not only that, the fuel came from the Persian Gulf across those sea lanes. All kinds of foodstuffs and other materials from India across those sea lanes. If not for Midway, the expectation that the British had was that the Japanese would have the bulk of their navy in the Indian Ocean. They had raided into the Indian Ocean in early April of 1942, and then had withdrawn. The British understood that to be a reconnaissance and force, but the British figured they had no ability to really resist the Japanese. And if the Japanese were able to return to the Indian Ocean in the summer of 1942, which because of Midway they were not, it would have been nearly impossible to sustain those sea lanes in safety and build up the force in Alamein. And if you didn't have the Battle of Alamein, you would have had a German army in the heart of the Middle East, south of the Caucasus. And Hitler's grand scheme was a pincer movement to grab the oil of the Soviet Union in the Caucasus. The idea was that an army ensconced in the Middle East would act as a kind of anvil, the giant hammer coming down through Russia. But when that hammer came down, there's nothing below it. There was no anvil for it to strike. It was swinging through air. In other words, the idea here, and this is Schlesinger's argument, the argument of other historians, was that if you don't have Midway, you don't have Alamein. If you don't have Alamein, you have a German army in the Middle East in late 1942, early 1943. And that fact, or that possibility, would have had a good chance of altering the outcome in Hitler's campaign against Russia. Hitler wins the war. This was why Schlesinger said the stakes at Midway were nothing less, in his phrase, as civilizational. That's what was really at stake. It might be a judgment from hindsight, but that doesn't necessarily make it wrong. And that's why I said, look, this is why Midway is this battle that he complained at time was underestimated. In some ways, I think it still is underestimated. It opens the door to the others. Now, I'll conclude by just mentioning again this business about D-Day, because it was something Schlesinger addressed specifically and explicitly. That one of the things that Midway does, it's an important political effect that has a strategic impact. And the political effect was that if you didn't have Midway or something like Midway, where the United States had achieved a substantial and visible victory against Japan, it would have been politically impossible for any president to focus a substantial portion of American forces on Europe. It's one thing to talk about Europe first. It's one thing to talk about the danger of Hitler in the abstract. It's another thing to actually do it when you've still got the country, the power that struck the United States directly, running around without any damage. That Midway actually frees up or provides the political capital and the will and the ability to shift resources to Europe. That happens with the United States. We know that this happened with on the British side. There was, I had a set of books up here since this was one of the books. The last one there, the Royal Navy and Eastern Waters by Andrew Boyd, which came about 3-4 years ago now. Boyd is a retired British diplomat who spent his career specializing in naval and intelligence matters. Anyways, in retirement, decided to write a Ph.D. dissertation in naval history and wrote on the Indian Ocean. And it's the most thorough study we have on the documentary base of what happened in British thinking in probably 41, 42 about the Indian Ocean. And Boyd's uncovered the actual planning documents where the British in the summer of 1942, or in the spring of 1942, before Midway, were expecting to be forced to send the bulk of their navy, at least its most modern ships, direct them away from the Mediterranean and the Western Atlantic into the Indian Ocean, simply to try to keep those sea lanes open. And that what Midway had done was to relieve that pressure and allow the British to keep their fleet, the bulk of it, in the Eastern Atlantic, focused on busting open the Mediterranean. And even though the British force was not the sole component in the landings of Operation Torch, where British and American forces, in conjunction with Alamein, land in French-controlled Morocco and Algeria, that Operation Torch would have been utterly impossible if the British had implemented what they planned to do in June and July of 1942, which Midway completely changed. So this is how I say, this is why I would suggest that Midway has a much greater significance than simply being an impressive a tactical victory, which is the way it's usually thought of. That's why it's made like 2 blockbuster movies. Makes a good movie. What doesn't make such a good movie is trying to explain the long-term consequences. So I'll end there. I never got to the Falklands, but this isn't Britain, so I'll be the only one that feels bad about it. Okay, thank you very much. I'm happy to. I know I've gone on. I'm happy to take your questions.
Geography